In today's lesson, we're going to talk about reciprocals and dividing fractions. Now, we've talked about opposite operations and how one undoes the other. Well, division undoes multiplying, and you are going to flip over how awesome this is. So much fun. All right, reciprocals are also known as multiplicative inverses, which, if you'll remember way back when, that was one of our properties of real numbers that we talked about. So here we have a fraction, 7/8, and we want to know what the reciprocal is. Well, the reciprocal is, pay careful attention, 8/7. You see how the numerator and the denominator switched places? I said you were going to flip. What happens if we multiply a number by its reciprocal? Well, let's look at what we just had. 7/8, its reciprocal is 8/7. If we multiply, remember multiplying straight across, numerators and denominators, 7 times 8 is 56, and we get 56/56. Simplify your fractions and you get 1. Well, actually, there is a general rule that states this very thing, and it is called the multiplicative the multiplicative property of reciprocals. So for all non-zero numbers, a and b, we have a over b times its reciprocal, which is b over a, which equals 1. And this holds true for all fractions and their inverses. So let's have a look at an integer. Well, it doesn't look like a fraction, so how do I find the reciprocal? Well, actually, you can write any integer as a fraction. Always there is a 1 below the integer. We just don't see it. It's understood to be there. We just don't need to write it down. So the reciprocal of this is how you're going to want to write it, a negative on the bottom because you see it with the 3. But this is not technically correct. It's not correct form. Mathematically, it will be true, but it's not the form in which we write it. We always write the negative on the top with the numerator, or we'll write it right out in front of the fraction. And usually that's how I like to write it. So here we have 3/4. Its reciprocal is 4/3. Remember, we flipped the fraction, and that's the reciprocal. Well, be very careful in this, because if you have a mixed number, such as 2 and 3/4, you absolutely cannot write it as 2 and 4/3. So you'll notice what's happening here is that you're going to want to take the fractional part and just switch that. But you can't do that. So here's what you have to do. You have to change all your mixed numbers into an improper fraction. Now remember, we take the whole number, multiply it by the denominator, so 2 times 4, which is 8, and you add 3, and we're going to get 11/4. So that's the fraction that we're going to take the reciprocal of. And if we take the reciprocal of that, we see that it's 4/11. So using reciprocals divide. Remember in the lesson about multiplying fractions where we just multiplied straight across? It was so super easy. Well, when we use reciprocals to divide, there's only one step more, and then it's just as simple. So the first thing we have to do is take the reciprocal of the second fraction and then multiply. Well, what does that mean? That means flip the second fraction and go ahead and multiply. So let's do that. So here we have our two fractions that we want to divide. So let's flip the second fraction and multiply. So now we multiply straight across, and we get 3 times 5 is 15, 7 times 2 is 14. And always simplify. In this case, this one's already simplified. Well, what if you have a mixed number and you want to divide by a fraction? Well, remember what we said. We said change any mixed numbers to improper fractions and then go ahead and do your divisions using reciprocals. So 3 times 7 is 21, plus 4 is 25/7. And then we're going to take that, and we're going to take the reciprocal of the second fraction and multiply. Remember, taking the reciprocal simply means flip the second fraction, and then go ahead and do your multiplication, which is just straight across. All right, so we get 25/7 times 9/5 gives us 225/35. Always, always, always simplify. And by using our divisibility rules, we know that those are both divisible by 5. So if we take each of the numerator divided by 5 is 45, denominator divided by 5 is 7. And that is a simplified fraction. All right, so what about those pesky little negatives that sometimes pop up? Not to worry. We already know how to deal with it. Trust me on this one. All right, so here we have negative 3 1/4 divided by 4 3/8. We're still going to do the exact same thing. Doesn't matter that there's a negative, we're still going to change our mixed numbers into improper fractions. So when we do that, we notice we get a negative 13/4. You have to keep your negative, can't get rid of it, divided by 35/8. Now these are the two improper fractions that we want to go ahead and divide. So what we're going to do that is take the reciprocal of the second fraction and then multiply. So remember, reciprocal means to flip, so we're going to flip the second fraction and our division becomes multiplication. Now when we multiply straight across. Now here's where the negatives come into play. Negative 13 times a positive 8 is going to give us a negative answer because as we learned before, a negative times a positive is always a negative. So the same rules apply, doesn't matter that there's fractions. So we're going to multiply negative 13 times 8 and 4 times 35, and we're going to see that we get negative 104 over 140. Now you'll notice that those two numbers, the numerator and the denominator, are even numbers, so we are not quite done. We want to simplify. We can simply divide both the top and the bottom by 4, and we see that we get negative 26 over 35. Now that is a simplified fraction. Well, how about negative 4 divided by negative 4 2/5? How do we handle that? Well, again, we're going to do the same thing, change our mixed numbers into improper fractions. And what do we do with this guy? Well, remember, any integer can be changed into or written as a fraction. It is simply over 1. So we get negative 4 over 1 divided by negative 22 over 5. Now, these are the two fractions that we want to go ahead and divide. We divide the same way that we've been dividing. We take the reciprocal of the second fraction and then we multiply. And of course, by now we know that to take the reciprocal means we flip the second fraction and the division becomes multiplication. Multiplication, we multiply straight across. Now we have a negative and a negative, so a negative times a negative is going to give us a positive. So we could say negative 4 times negative 5, or we can say 4 times 5. It's going to give us the same answer because a negative times a negative gives us a positive. So we get 20 over 22. Again, we have to reduce our fractions. So in order to reduce our fractions, we get 20 divided by 2 and 22 divided by 2, which gives us 10 over 11. And that is your simplified fraction, and that is your lesson on reciprocals and dividing fractions.